For millions of years, nature seemed to follow its own unwritten rules. Wolves lived with wolves, bears remained bears, whales crossed oceans without ever becoming something else. Evolution drew invisible lines, and for the most part, life respected them. But every rule has its exception. Somewhere between melting ice, changing forests, and the growing footprint of humans, those invisible boundaries began to disappear. Species that had spent thousands of years apart suddenly found themselves sharing the same world. And when that happened, nature started creating animals. That almost seemed impossible. Not monsters, not mistakes, but living evidence that the world around them is changing faster than ever before. Today, we'll meet 8 extraordinary animals that many people believe shouldn't exist. Yet each one tells a story, far bigger than itself. Because sometimes, the strangest creatures on Earth aren't breaking nature's rules. They're revealing that nature has quietly begun writing new ones. For most of history, polar bears and grizzly bears lived in different worlds. One belonged to the frozen Arctic, the other to forests and open land farther south. They were close enough on the evolutionary tree to recognize each other, but separated by distance, climate, and habitat. Then those boundaries began to shift. Sea ice retreated, temperatures changed, grizzlies moved farther north, while polar bears were forced to spend more time on land, and eventually, the two worlds touched. What appeared next looked almost unreal. A bear with the pale coat of the Arctic, the heavier build of a grizzly, and traits borrowed from both, the Pizzly Bear. But this wasn't simply nature creating something new. It was a warning, because the Pizzly exists. For the same reason the old boundary disappeared. The environment changed first. The animal came second. And that raises a disturbing question. If a warming world can bring together species that once lived apart, how many other creatures are already being created, without us even noticing? The next one was hidden for years, until scientists found proof in something that looked almost impossible. Some discoveries don't happen because scientists are looking for them. They happen because nature quietly leaves behind a clue. For decades, the narwhal and the beluga shared the same icy waters. They looked nothing alike. One carried a long spiral tusk, earning the nickname the unicorn of the sea. The other was completely white, with a rounded head and a permanent-looking smile. They belonged to the same family, but few imagined their stories would ever cross. Then, an unusual skull was discovered. It didn't belong to a narwhal. It wasn't a beluga either. Its strange combination of features puzzled researchers for years, until DNA revealed the truth. It was something entirely unexpected, a hybrid, now known as the Narluga. No one knows exactly how many have ever existed. They are so rare that every confirmed case feels almost impossible. But rarity isn't what makes the Narluga fascinating. It is what the animal represents. Somewhere beneath the Arctic ice, species that once followed separate paths are beginning to meet. And every new meeting creates another opportunity for nature to experiment. The next creature didn't appear in the frozen Arctic. It emerged much closer to people. And unlike the Narluga, it isn't rare anymore. It may already be living, right outside someone's backyard. For centuries, North America knew exactly who its predators were. There were wolves, powerful enough to bring down elk. There were coyotes, smaller, quieter, masters of survival. Each had its own place, its own territory, its own role. Then people changed the landscape. Forests disappeared. Roads divided ancient habitats. Wolf populations collapsed, while coyotes expanded into places they had never lived before. And somewhere, between disappearing wilderness and growing cities, the impossible happened. The old boundaries faded, not with a battle, but with a meeting. The result wasn't quite a wolf, it wasn't quite a coyote, and it wasn't just a larger version of either one. It inherited the wolf's strength, the coyote's adaptability, and in some populations, even traces of domestic dog DNA. Scientists call it the Coywolf. But what makes the Coywolf remarkable isn't simply its mixed ancestry. It's what happened next. Instead of struggling to survive, it adapted. It learned to move through forests, farmland, and even the edges of busy cities. While many predators retreated from human civilization, this one quietly learned how to live alongside it, not hidden deep in the wilderness, but sometimes only a few streets away. And if the Coywolf shows us how nature adapts to a changing world, the next creature tells a very different story, because this time, it wasn't nature that crossed the line. It was us. Not every impossible animal was created by nature. Some began with a simple human idea. In the 1950s, scientists in Brazil believed they could solve a problem. European honeybees produced excellent honey, but in the tropical heat of South America, they struggled to survive. African honeybees were stronger, hardier, better adapted to the climate. So the plan seemed almost obvious. Combine the best qualities of both. Create the perfect honeybee. For a moment, it sounded like a success. Until the bees escaped. No one intended to release them. But nature doesn't recognize laboratory fences. Once they were free, there was no calling them back. The hybrids spread, generation after generation, crossing forests, farmland, and eventually entire countries. Today, they're known around the world as killer bees, not because they're monsters, and not because they produce deadlier venom than other honeybees, but because they defend their colonies with extraordinary aggression, turning a single mistake into thousands of stings. What began as an attempt to improve nature became a reminder that changing evolution is far easier than controlling the consequences. And yet, even killer bees were never meant to last forever. The next creatures reveal something even stranger. Sometimes, nature allows impossible animals to be born, only to make sure they can never truly replace the species that created them. By now, it might seem as though evolution has no limits. Give nature enough time, or enough opportunity, and almost anything becomes possible. But that's only half the story, because every time two different species manage to create something new, nature asks a second question. Can it continue? The answer is often no. Take the Liger, the largest cat on Earth, born from a male lion and a female tiger. Powerful, extraordinary, almost unbelievable. At first glance, it looks like evolution has created something better than either parent, but appearances can be deceiving. Many ligers face serious health challenges, and while some females can reproduce, most males are infertile. The same pattern appears again in one of history's oldest hybrids, the mule. For thousands of years, people have relied on mules to carry supplies across mountains, cross deserts, and work fields where horses and donkeys struggled. They are stronger than a donkey, often more resilient than a horse. Yet despite all those advantages, almost every mule reaches the same dead end. It cannot pass its genes to the next generation. It's as if nature quietly whispers, "You may exist, but you cannot replace what came before." For every hybrid that opens a new door, another finds a wall it cannot cross. And yet, sometimes, breaking those rules becomes the only reason a species survives at all. The next animal proves that without hybridization, it might already be gone forever. For most of this story, hybrid animals have seemed like accidents, unexpected, unstable. sometimes even dangerous. But every rule has an exception. Deep in the swamps and forests of Florida, one of America's rarest big cats was quietly disappearing. Not because hunters were chasing it, not because it had forgotten how to survive, but because there were simply too few left. Generation after generation, the same bloodlines repeated themselves. The population shrank, genetic diversity vanished, and with it, the future of the species. Scientists faced an impossible decision: protect the Florida panther by keeping its bloodline pure, or save it by allowing new genes to enter. They chose the second path. Texas pumas were introduced, bringing something the panthers had been losing for decades: diversity. The change wasn't immediate, but over time, health improved. The population slowly began to recover. For this one endangered predator, hybridization wasn't the end of its story. It became the reason the story could continue. Sometimes, survival doesn't come from protecting the past. It comes from accepting change. But change has another side, because while one wildcat was saved by new genes, another is disappearing because of them. For the Florida panther, new genes became a lifeline. For another wildcat, they became a slow goodbye, hidden among the forests of Scotland, lives and animals so elusive that most people will never see one in the wild. The Scottish wildcat. For thousands of years, it survived harsh winters, scarce food, and some of Europe's toughest landscapes. It outlasted predators. It outlasted changing climates. It even outlasted centuries of human expansion. But the greatest threat to its future didn't come from hunters, or disease, or disappearing forests. It came from ordinary domestic cats. As wildcats and feral cats began crossing paths, their offspring carried a mixture of both bloodlines. Generation after generation, those wild genes became harder to find until scientists faced an unsettling possibility. One day, the Scottish wildcat might not vanish through extinction. It might simply become impossible to distinguish from the animals around it. Its body could survive, its DNA could continue, but the species itself would quietly fade away. Sometimes, nature doesn't erase a creature overnight. Sometimes, it slowly blurs the line until the original is gone. And if that sounds strangely familiar, it's because the final chapter of this story isn't about bears, or wolves, or wild cats. It's about us. For most of this journey, hybridization has felt like something happening somewhere else. In the Arctic, in forests, in laboratories, in animals whose lives seem completely separate from ours. But the final surprise is much closer. Because hybridization is not only part of the animal world, it is part of us. Long before modern humans became the only human species left, we shared the planet with others, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and when our ancestors met them, they did not always remain separate. They had children, and those children had children of their own. The result is still carried today, inside the DNA of millions of people. Small genetic traces passed down across tens of thousands of years. Genes connected to immune responses, cold adaptation, and survival in extreme environments. Which means the story we've been following was never only about strange animals. It was also about human history. We are not standing outside evolution, watching it experiment. We are one of its experiments. And perhaps that changes the question completely. Because if hybridization helped shape bears, wolves, wild cats, and even us, then maybe these animals were never unnatural at all. Maybe the only thing that was unnatural was our belief that nature ever followed clean lines. When we first began this journey, it was easy to believe these animals were exceptions. creatures that somehow slipped through nature's rules. A bear born where two worlds collided. A whale no one expected. A predator shaped by changing landscapes. A bee created by human ambition. A wildcat saved by new blood, while another slowly disappeared because of it. Each story seemed different, until they all pointed toward the same truth. Nature has never been standing still. It has always been changing, experimenting, adapting, long before we were here to witness it. The difference today is not that evolution has suddenly begun breaking its own rules. The difference is that the world itself is changing faster than ever before. Habitats overlap, climates shift, species meet in ways they never did before, and nature responds, the only way it knows how, by trying something new. So perhaps these animals shouldn't exist if the world had remained the same. But the world didn't, and neither did they. Maybe the real mystery was never why these animals exist. Maybe the real mystery is what nature will create next. If you enjoyed this journey into one of evolution's strangest stories, let us know which animal surprised you the most in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by the hidden forces shaping life on Earth, don't forget to subscribe to Wild Unknown, because out there, nature is still writing new stories, and we've only just begun to read them.